Many of us went our entire lives without receiving a proper education when it comes to things like money, saving, investing. School may have taught us how to play the ukulele, but it didn't teach us important things that we actually need to know. Now, maybe you're still learning, or maybe you've mostly got it figured out by now, but I think we can all agree that we wished we had learned about basic money concepts at an earlier age than we actually did. So I think it's vitally important that we break the cycle and teach our kids about finance because, let's face it, school won't teach that. So in this video, I'm going to share a personal experience from my childhood, how a simple life lesson completely changed the way I saw money, power, and a bunch of other important concepts. At the time, I was maybe 12 years old, and I was big into sports, and so naturally, I loved collecting baseball and basketball cards like many young boys did. I wanted to be able to buy more basketball cards, but in order to do that, I needed more money. So I did what I thought was appropriate at the time, and I asked my dad for an allowance. I knew that other kids my age were getting money from their parents, and so I felt it only fair that I get some money too. So I went and asked my dad for an allowance, and he just laughed at me and said that in life, people aren't simply going to give you money because you want it. You need to work for it and earn your money. So I was disappointed because, like I said, other kids my age got an allowance, but what he'd said did kind of make sense. I mean, I knew my dad worked, and that's how he got money, so it makes sense that I should work too, right? So I asked him, all right, what can I do? I want to work. And he said, all right, I'll tell you what. You get out the lawnmower and go around and mow the grass at every rental property that I own, and I'll pay you $3 an hour. Now, my dad owned several houses in the small town that we lived in, and all the houses were within reasonable walking distance. And so I did. I got out the lawnmower and I went around and cut all the grass, and it took me a couple of hours. And by the time I was done, I was exhausted. But when I finally got home, true to his word, he paid me the money. Now, $3 an hour doesn't sound like much now, but remember, this was in the early 90s, and I was 12, so as far as I was concerned, I was rich. And I couldn't have been happier, and I raced to the store to spend my newfound fortune on basketball cards, and this process kept up for a month or two, and I was buying so many basketball cards, but it was right around that time that I'd begun to outgrow my bike, and I needed a new one. So, logically, I asked for a new bike, and the first words out of my dad's mouth was, well, how much money have you saved up to buy yourself a bike? And I instantly didn't like where this conversation was going. I hadn't saved any of my money, and my dad wasn't going to buy me one. I was screwed. In fact, I usually spent all of my money about 10 minutes after I got it, as that was how long it took me to run to the store to buy cards. So at this point, my dad taught me the importance of saving and budgeting. Instead of spending all of my money on basketball cards, instead he taught me to spend some of it on cards and save the rest for other things that I might want or need. Now, it took me a while, but eventually I was able to save up and get that bike. But the problem was that while I'm saving for a bike, I was no longer able to buy as many cards as I was used to. So I asked my dad for a raise so that I could better afford to do both things. But I knew my dad, and I knew he wasn't going to just give in easily and just give me a raise just because I asked. And so I did my research. I asked some other people how much money they made cutting grass. I was so proud of myself, age 12, and doing my own financial research. And that's when I learned something very disturbing. I found out that the average wage for cutting grass was about $15 an hour. 15! And I was getting paid $3. My dad was a businessman. He knew exactly what the going rates were, and he was purposely screwing me. His own son, how could he do that? I was so mad I went back to my dad and I demanded a raise. I laid out my arguments. I was a good worker. The grass always looked phenomenal. I was always available to cut the grass so there was never any delays. And most importantly, I deserved a raise because he had been screwing me. When I was done, he looked up from his chair and simply said one word: no. And then he turned back to reading his book. Oh, man. If you thought I was furious before, you can only imagine how I felt now. I begged and pleaded with him, asking for $12 an hour instead of $15, or how about $10 an hour, something, anything. How could he screw me like this? And the lower in price I was willing to accept, the more he just smirked and said no, until I finally shouted, "I quit." And once again, he calmly said, "No, you won't. You need that $3 too bad to quit, because I know how much you like buying basketball cards. You may not get as much money as you want, but if you quit, you won't have any money, which means you won't be able to buy any cards. And for that reason, I know you will never quit." I was on the verge of tears, and that's when he put the book down and explained to me a very important concept. He explained to me that when you work for someone else, they have all the power. The boss has all the power, and the employee has none. They are the ones that dictate your wages. They dictate what you are worth. And he said, what's worse is that I knew I was worth $15 an hour. Heck, I was probably worth more than that because I did a great job. But when you realized you didn't have any negotiating power, you gave up on yourself and started settling for scraps. You would have been happy to settle for $12 or $10 an hour, even though you knew that you were worth much more than that. He said I was trapped in a job I hated because of my desire to buy stuff. And similarly, he said most people in the real world are trapped too. They have just enough money to buy food and a few things that they want, which keeps them just happy enough to continue to accept the leftover scraps that their boss gives them. So I looked up at him and quietly asked, so how do I get the power instead of the boss? And he said, as long as you're an employee, you will never have the power. The boss always has the power. He said, if you want the power, you need to be the boss. You need to be the owner of the company and not an employee of someone else. And while I kind of understood what he was saying, it didn't really resonate with me. I didn't understand how to turn the tables and for me to be the owner instead of an employee. So I quietly left the room to go think about it. And it took me a couple of days to figure it out, but I was obsessed. I was thinking about this nonstop. I knew that my dad wasn't trying to just be a jerk and that he was trying to teach me something, and I wanted so desperately to figure it out. Partially because I wanted to prove to my dad I could do it, and partially just because I wanted those silly basketball cards. And then it hit me. I ran out the door and went up and down the blocks knocking on everyone's front door. I told everyone that I met that I was interested in mowing their yard and that I would be willing to cut their grass for $15 an hour. And I didn't have great success, but I did find 3 people that said yes. After I'd cut their grass, I went home and confidently walked up to my dad and sternly said, I quit. He looked at me confused for a moment, and I went on to say that I was no longer willing to work for him cutting his grass. However, I said, I've just formed my own lawn care company and already have 3 clients. I continued by saying that my company would be willing to handle all of his lawn care needs for $20 an hour. Sure, I said, you can probably find a cheaper source of labor using the competition, but you won't find a more reliable company or one that does as good of a job. At that point, I could tell from my dad's face that he was beaming with pride. He was trying to hide it as, try to stay in character as the cool, level-headed businessman, but his face was betraying him and he couldn't quite control his joy. He said just one word, deal, and we shook hands on it. I'd learned the importance of hard work, saving, budgeting, negotiating, the importance of knowing your self-worth, entrepreneurship, and a bunch of other useful concepts. As a side note to the story, I later found out when I turned 18 that my dad had been paying me $15 all along. He was giving me $3 to spend and putting the other $12 into an investment account that he opened up in my name. To this day, I'm eternally thankful of the lessons that I learned that summer, and I sometimes wonder how my life might have been different if instead he had simply given me an allowance. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and give me a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm. And as always, I'll see you all again next time. Thanks.